The lavender in Aurelia Penn's basket had gone half to ruin under the crowd's shoving feet before she even noticed the old man being pushed aside. "Out of the way, you old fool!" A gentleman in a fine grey coat knocked past him with his cane, not so much as turning his head. Behind him came a lady in silk skirts, who wrinkled her nose at the sight of the old man's plain, sodden wool coat, as though he were something the rain had washed up from the gutter. "Look at the state of him," she said to her companion, loud enough for half the portico to hear. "Wandering about theatre steps dressed like a farmhand. Someone ought to tell him this is no place for beggars." The old man said nothing. He only tightened his grip on his walking stick and tried to steady himself against the stone pillar, his boots slipping on the wet cobbles. Nobody offered a hand. Nobody so much as slowed down. The crowd from St. Jude's Royal Theatre poured out into the storm like a flood let loose, all silk hems and shining boots, every one of them far too concerned with keeping their own hair dry to spare a glance for a stranger struggling to stand. Aurelia watched it happen from her spot beneath the stone arch, where she'd been trying to sell the last of her lavender before the weather ruined it completely. She was used to being invisible to people like that. Flower girls rarely rated a second look from the theatre crowd, not unless they were young and pretty enough to be worth a coin for the show of it. But, invisible or not, she wasn't about to stand there and watch an old man get knocked into the mud. She crossed the portico in a few quick steps, dodging a footman and a pair of quarrelling sisters, and reached the old man just as his cane skidded and his knee buckled. "Steady now," she said, catching his arm before he went down. "You'll do yourself an injury standing out here in this." He looked at her with startled grey eyes, rain dripping from the brim of his plain felt hat. Up close he was older than she'd first thought, his face lined deep with years, but there was nothing frail about the way he studied her. Sharp, careful, like a man weighing a stranger's worth before trusting his own weight to her arm. "I am quite capable of standing, young woman," he said, though his voice wavered with the effort of it. "I've no doubt of it," Aurelia said, not unkindly. "But not on ice, and not with half of London trampling over you like you're not even there." She didn't wait for his permission. She pulled her wooden stool out from behind her flower cart and set it against the dry stretch of wall beneath the arch, then guided him onto it before he could protest further. His coat was soaked clean through, the wool gone dark and heavy with rain, and his hands, when she caught them steadying him, were cold as the stone at her back. "You'll catch your death sitting in wet wool," she muttered, mostly to herself, and before she could think better of it, she'd untied the oilcloth wrap from around her own shoulders, the one thing keeping her dry that evening, and draped it over him instead. "I couldn't possibly," he began, but she was already tucking the edges in around his arms. "You could, and you will. I've been out in worse than this plenty of times. You look as though you haven't." For a moment, the old man simply stared at her, and something in his expression shifted. Surprise, she thought, though there was a flicker of something else beneath it, something almost like recognition, as if he were seeing a kind of person he hadn't expected to find standing under a theatre portico on a night like this. "What is your name, girl?" he asked.
"Aurelia. Aurelia Penn."
"And you make your living selling flowers in weather such as this?" "When the weather allows it, yes." She glanced toward her half-ruined basket with a small, rueful smile. "Tonight it hasn't allowed much." He was quiet after that, watching the rain sheet down past the edge of the arch, watching the last of the theatre crowd hurry off toward their waiting carriages without so much as a backward glance at the man they'd shoved aside minutes before. Aurelia crouched beside her basket, salvaging what lavender she could, and didn't think much more of it. She'd done what any decent person ought to do. There was nothing remarkable in it, so far as she was concerned, only common sense and a bit of common kindness, the kind she'd have wanted for herself if her own legs had ever failed her on a night like this. She didn't know, as she wrung the rain from her shawl and settled in to wait out the storm, that the man, now wrapped in her only dry cloth, was no farmhand, no beggar, no forgotten old soul with nowhere else to be. She didn't know his name was Kingswood, or that somewhere across the city, in a manor surrounded by rolling countryside, his son answered to the title of Duke. All she knew was that the rain showed no sign of stopping, and that the old man beside her, whoever he was, looked as though he badly needed someone willing to stay. The rain hadn't let up by the time the theatre crowds thinned to nothing, and Aurelia knew better than to wait out a storm like this one under an open arch. She'd spent enough winters on these streets to know where the water would start pooling once the gutters gave out, and the portico at St. Jude's was not a place to be caught when that happened. "Come along," she said, gathering what remained of her lavender into the basket and slinging it over one arm.
"There's a proper shelter not far from here. Dry stone and out of the wind besides."
The old man hesitated, his grey eyes searching her face as though trying to work out what a stranger might want from leading him somewhere unfamiliar in the dark. Aurelia didn't wait for him to decide. She simply held out her arm, steady and unbothered, the way she might have offered it to her own grandfather, and after a moment he took it. "You needn't trouble yourself further on my account," he said, as they made their way down the slick cobbles, his walking stick tapping out an uneven rhythm beside her steps. "It's no trouble. I'd be a poor sort of person if I left you to catch your death for the sake of avoiding a little trouble." The shelter she led him to was an old archway near St. Jude's churchyard, a stretch of masonry that had likely once been part of a gatehouse before the rest of it crumbled away. It kept the worst of the wind out, and the stone floor, though cold, was dry. Aurelia had slept there herself more nights than she cared to count, back before she'd found steadier lodging in Willow Lane. She settled the old man against the driest section of wall and lowered herself down beside him, close enough to share what warmth there was between them. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The rain drummed steadily beyond the archway, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour, though Aurelia lost count of the strikes. It was her stomach that broke the silence first, a low complaint she couldn't quite hide, and she felt her face warm with embarrassment even in the dark. "You haven't eaten," the old man said. It wasn't a question. "I've eaten well enough." It was mostly true. She'd had a bit of bread that morning, before the market fees had eaten into what little she'd earned. She hadn't planned on anything more until tomorrow, but there was no sense telling him that. He said nothing more, but she noticed the way his gaze lingered on her, thoughtful and quiet, as though he were turning something over in his mind. Aurelia reached into her basket instead and pulled out the small loaf of coarse rye bread she'd been saving, wrapped in a bit of cloth to keep the rain off it. It wasn't much, barely enough for one person to make a proper meal of it, but she broke it cleanly in two and held half out to him. "I couldn't take your supper from you," he said, though his eyes betrayed him, flicking briefly to the bread before returning to her face. "You're not taking it. I'm giving it. There's a difference." She pressed it into his hand before he could argue further. "Besides, I'd rather share what little I have than eat alone while you sit there hungry beside me. That's no way to spend a night." He accepted it slowly, almost reluctantly, and for a while they ate in a companionable sort of quiet, the bread dry and plain, but welcome all the same. Aurelia found herself watching him, without quite meaning to, the careful, deliberate way he ate, as though he'd been taught manners long ago and never quite lost them, even now, huddled in a stone archway with rain pouring beyond the arch. "You're not from these streets," she said, eventually. It wasn't an accusation, only an observation. "I've lived near this quarter most of my life. I know most every face that passes through it, and I don't know yours." "I've been away a long while," he said, which told her nothing at all, though something in the way he said it made her decide not to press further. Everyone had their reasons for keeping to themselves. She had plenty of her own. As he shifted to pull his damp coat tighter around himself, something slipped loose from an inner pocket and struck the stone floor with a soft, metallic clatter. Aurelia bent at once and retrieved it before the water pooling near the archway's edge could reach it. A pocket watch, silver and finely made, its case catching what little light there was. She turned it over once in her palm and saw an engraving pressed into the metal, an ornate crest she didn't recognize, though it was clearly the mark of someone with money enough to commission such fine work. "He dropped this," she said, holding it out to him. He took it back with a strange sort of care, his fingers closing around it as though it mattered to him more than anything else he carried. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It's a fine piece," Aurelia said, not quite able to help herself. "You'll want to keep a closer eye on it. Something like that could fetch a proper sum if it ever fell into the wrong hands." "Would it fall into yours, I wonder, if I were careless enough to lose it again?" She looked at him, surprised by the question, and then let out a short laugh despite herself.
"I've little use for silver watches, sir. I wouldn't know the first thing to do with one, beyond returning it to whoever it belonged to." He studied her for a long moment after that, something unreadable passing behind his grey eyes, and then he tucked the watch away without another word. Outside, the rain had begun, at last, to soften. Aurelia woke to grey light creeping through the archway and the strange stillness that follows a storm once it's finally spent itself. Her neck ached from sleeping against stone, and her shawl had slipped down sometime in the night, leaving her shoulders cold. She sat up slowly, blinking the sleep from her eyes, and it took her a moment to notice what her half-waking mind had already sensed. The space beside her was empty. "Sir?" she said, though there was no real hope in it. The archway held nothing but the damp smell of last night's rain and the faint grey light of early morning creeping across the flagstones. She pushed herself up properly then, rubbing warmth back into her arms, and looked around the small shelter as though he might simply be standing just out of sight, waiting for her to wake. He wasn't. Wherever the old man had gone, he'd gone quietly, without waking her, without so much as a word of farewell. Aurelia felt an odd little pang at that. Not quite hurt, not quite worry, but something close to both. She hadn't expected gratitude. She hadn't done what she'd done for the sake of thanks. But it seemed a strange way to part from someone after sharing bread and shelter through a storm, to simply vanish before first light. It was only when she rose fully to her feet, meaning to gather her basket and be on her way, that she saw it. His walking stick, leaning neatly against the far wall of the archway, exactly where he'd rested it the night before. Polished, dark wood, worn smooth along the grip from years of use, with a small brass cap at its foot that had likely once shone brighter than it did now. She crossed to it and picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was a fine piece, finer than she'd properly noticed in the dark the night before. The wood had a good weight to it, and the carving along its length, though simple, was the sort of careful work that came from a skilled hand rather than a hurried one. Not the sort of thing a man forgot easily, she thought, nor the sort of thing he'd want to be without for long, not with his knees as unsteady as they'd been. She supposed he might have simply left in a hurry, eager to be off before the morning traffic filled the streets, and forgotten it in his haste. Old men forgot things. Her own grandfather, before he'd passed, had spent his last years misplacing his spectacles a dozen times a day, convinced each time that someone in the house had hidden them from him out of spite. Still, something about it didn't sit quite right with her. He hadn't struck her as a forgetful sort of man. If anything, he'd seemed the opposite, careful, watchful, the kind of man who noticed things others missed, the way he'd studied her face the evening before, as though reading something written there that she herself couldn't see. A man like that didn't simply walk off and leave his stick behind without noticing its absence within a dozen steps. Unless, she thought, he hadn't needed it once he'd gone. Unless someone had come for him in the night, some carriage or companion she hadn't heard over the last of the rain, and in the flurry of leaving he'd simply overlooked it. Whatever the reason, it didn't change the plain fact sitting in her hands. She couldn't leave it here. Someone had made that stick with care, and someone, an old man with tired knees and grey, watchful eyes, likely needed it back rather badly. Aurelia wrapped it carefully in the same cloth she'd used the night before to keep her bread dry, and tucked it lengthwise into her wicker basket, letting it rest along the bottom beneath where she'd stack her flowers for the day's trade. It fit awkwardly, jutting out a little past the basket's rim, but it would hold well enough until she found somewhere better to carry it. She told herself, as she stepped out from beneath the archway into the pale morning light, that she'd keep an eye out for him. London was a large city, true enough, but her trade kept her walking the same streets day after day, the theatre quarter, the flower market, the lanes leading down toward the river where the poorer sort gathered to sell whatever they could scrape together. An old man in a plain wool coat, wandering those same streets, might well cross her path again before the week was through. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he lodged or what business had brought him out into a storm dressed like a man with nothing to his name. But she knew his face, and she knew, now, the shape of the crest pressed into that silver watch, even if she couldn't have said what family it belonged to. It was enough to be going on with. She'd ask about, perhaps, the next time she passed a stall-keeper who might know more of the city's comings and goings than she did herself. And if nothing came of it, well, she'd simply keep the stick safe until fortune saw fit to cross their paths again. Stranger things had happened in London than an old man and a flower girl meeting twice over. The streets were beginning to stir around her now, carts rattling over the wet cobbles, shopkeepers pulling back their shutters to greet the morning trade. Aurelia settled her basket more firmly against her hip, felt the stick shift and settle within it, and set off toward Blackfriars, telling herself there was nothing more to the matter than an old man's forgetfulness and a young woman's plain sense of duty. She had no way of knowing, as she walked, that the very carriage that had come for him in the night belonged to a house whose name half of London spoke with careful respect, nor that her search for him, however small it seemed to her now, had already been noticed by eyes far more watchful than her own. The Blackfriars flower market was already thick with noise and mud by the time Aurelia arrived, carts jostling for space along the muddy lane and vendors calling out their prices over one another. She found her usual spot near the fountain, wedged between a woman selling boiled sweets and an old fishmonger whose stall always left the whole corner smelling faintly of the river, and began setting out what remained of her lavender alongside the fresh violets she'd bought that morning on credit. She'd barely finished arranging her basket when a shadow fell across her stall. "New fees today?" said the man standing over her, a stocky fellow in a brown coat she didn't recognize, holding a ledger under one arm like it gave him some manner of authority. "Twopence more per stall, effective this morning, by order of the market's new management." Aurelia straightened up slowly. "Twopence more? And who might the new management be exactly? Last I heard it was still Mr. Halloway keeping the accounts here, same as it's been these 5 years. "Mr. Halloway's retired," the man said, not quite meeting her eye. "The lease has changed hands. New rules come with it. You'll pay the new rate, same as everyone else, or you'll clear your stall and make room for someone who will." "I've a permit," Aurelia said, reaching into her basket and producing the folded paper she kept tucked beneath her wares, careful not to disturb the walking stick resting alongside it. "Paid through the season, same as always. Nothing in it says the rate can simply double because some new man's taken over the lease." The stocky man barely glanced at the paper before waving it off. "That permit's near enough expired. You'll renew it under the new terms, or you won't renew it at all. Your choice, girl." Aurelia felt her jaw tighten, the old, familiar frustration rising in her chest. The same frustration she'd felt a dozen times over in dealing with men who thought a flower girl too poor and too powerless to argue her own case. She'd learned long ago that anger did her no good in moments like this. What she needed was steadiness, and the sort of firm, plain sense that men like this one had trouble arguing against. "I've traded honestly on this spot for 5 years, she said, keeping her voice level. "I've paid every fee on time, same as the rest of us here. If the management's changed, that's no fault of mine, and it's no reason to double what I owe without so much as a notice posted beforehand. Show me the new terms in writing, properly signed, and I'll gladly pay what's fair. Until then, I'll keep my stall as it stands." The man's face reddened, clearly unused to being challenged by someone half his size, with nothing but a basket of flowers to her name. But before he could press the matter further, a call went up from further down the row, some dispute over a fishmonger's cart blocking the lane, and he muttered something under his breath about coming back for her later before stalking off toward the commotion. Aurelia let out a slow breath once he'd gone, her hands still trembling slightly from the encounter, though she didn't let it show as she straightened her stall and returned to arranging her flowers. It wasn't the first time she'd had to fight for her place at market, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Still, the thought of losing her spot entirely, after everything she'd built here, sat heavy and cold in her stomach for the rest of the morning. She didn't notice, as she worked, the two men standing some distance off near the edge of the market, dressed plainly enough to pass unremarked among the morning crowd, though their coats were of a slightly finer cut than most who traded there. They'd been watching her since before the stocky man in brown had approached her stall, and they watched still, quiet and unhurried, as she went about the rest of her morning's trade.
She held her ground well enough, one of them murmured to the other, his eyes following Aurelia as she counted out change for a customer buying a small bunch of violets. Didn't raise her voice, didn't back down either. His lordship will want to hear of it, the second man said, along with the matter of the permit. She could have simply paid the man's fee and avoided the trouble altogether. Instead, she stood on principle over tuppence. Tuppence means a good deal more to a girl like her than it does to us. The first man nodded slowly, making a brief note in a small leather-bound book he kept tucked inside his coat, before the two of them turned and made their way out of the market without ever having approached her stall themselves. Aurelia, absorbed in the business of selling what flowers she could before the afternoon crowds arrived, never noticed them at all. By the time the sun had climbed higher and the worst of the morning trade had thinned, she'd nearly forgotten the stocky man's threat, though the worry of it still lingered somewhere at the back of her mind. She thought instead of the old man from the storm, wondering whether she might catch sight of him somewhere among the market's crowds, though she knew well enough it was an unlikely hope. London swallowed people whole easily enough, and a single grey-eyed stranger in a plain wool coat could vanish into it as easily as rain into the Thames. She had no notion, as she packed away her stall that evening and made her way back toward Willow Lane, that her honesty that morning had already been carried, in careful, quiet detail, to a house far grander than any she'd ever set foot inside, nor that the walking stick still resting in the bottom of her basket was about to change the whole shape of her life before the week was through. The carriage appeared on Willow Lane just as the last light was fading from the sky, and it was the sort of sight that stopped half the street in its tracks. Dark, well kept, drawn by a pair of matched horses that looked entirely out of place among the muddy ruts and sagging fences of the tenement yard, it rolled to a halt without a crest to mark it, without a single ornament to give away whose hand had sent it. That alone was enough to set the neighbours whispering behind their doorways. Aurelia had just come in from the day's trade, her feet aching and her basket lighter than she'd have liked, when she heard the commotion outside her window. She looked out to see her landlady, Mrs. Hab, already standing on the step with her arms crossed, eyeing the carriage with open suspicion, while a footman in plain but well-tailored livery climbed down from his seat and approached the yard with an air of quiet purpose. "I'm looking for a Miss Aurelia Penn," he said, addressing Mrs. Hab first, as was proper, though his eyes swept the row of narrow doors behind her. "And who's asking?" Mrs. Hab said, in the tone she reserved for anyone she suspected of bringing trouble to her lodgers. "A matter of some importance, on behalf of my employer." The footman held out a folded letter, sealed with a neat press of wax, offering no further explanation. "If Miss Penn is within, I'd be obliged if she'd receive this herself." Aurelia had already come down by then, drawn as much by curiosity as by the sound of her own name being spoken by a stranger. She took the letter from the footman's gloved hand, aware of Mrs. Hab watching her closely, and of the small crowd of neighbours who'd begun to gather at the mouth of the yard, drawn by the unusual sight of so fine a carriage parked among their washing lines and broken fences. The wax seal bore no crest she recognised, pressed instead with a plain, unmarked stamp, and for a moment she simply turned the letter over in her hands, reluctant to open it in front of so many watching eyes. "Go on, then," Mrs. Hab said, not unkindly, though there was a wary edge beneath it. "Best know what you're dealing with before it deals with you." Aurelia broke the seal and unfolded the letter, reading it once quickly, and then again more slowly, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming on a second pass. The hand was elegant, clearly written by someone well practiced in letters, and the message itself was brief. It requested, though the wording made plain it was closer to a summons than a request, her presence at Ashbourne Manor, at her earliest convenience, regarding a matter of family property. It offered no further detail beyond that, no name to explain who had sent it or why, only the promise that transport would be provided both ways and that the matter concerned something of consequence best discussed in person. Family property. The words sat strangely in her mind. She had no family property to speak of, nothing beyond the few belongings she kept in her small room and the basket she carried each day to market. Unless, she thought suddenly, her stomach tightening, they meant the walking stick. Perhaps whoever had sent this carriage believed she'd taken something that wasn't hers to keep and meant to see her answer for it. "What does it say?" Mrs. Hab asked, her arms still crossed, though her curiosity had plainly got the better of her caution. "They want me to come to some manor house," Aurelia said slowly. "Ashbourne, it says, about family property." Ashbourne. One of the neighbours, an older woman named Mrs. Culpepper, who'd lived on the lane longer than anyone, let out a low whistle from where she stood by the fence. "That's the Duke's estate, girl. Kingswood land out past the countryside. Fine houses and finer horses than the lot of us will ever see up close." Aurelia's heart gave an uneasy lurch at the name. Kingswood. The crest on the pocket watch, the one she'd returned to the old man in the archway, had been unfamiliar to her at the time, but she remembered now the shape of it well enough to wonder, with a growing unease, whether the two might be connected. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, mostly to herself, though the footman standing patiently by the carriage door seemed to hear it well enough. "No one has suggested otherwise, miss," he said. "My employer simply wishes to speak with you directly. The matter will be explained properly once you arrive." Aurelia looked from the letter to the carriage and then to the small crowd of neighbours watching her with a mixture of concern and open fascination, and felt, for a long moment, entirely unsure of what to do. It would have been easy enough to refuse, to send the footman away and go on with her ordinary evening as though the letter had never arrived at all. But there was something in the careful, formal wording of it, something in the quiet confidence of the footman's manner that told her refusing wouldn't simply make the matter disappear. If it was about the stick, better to explain herself now and be done with it, rather than let some grand family believe her a thief for the sake of a piece of carved wood she'd only ever meant to keep safe. "I'll need a moment to fetch my shawl," she said finally, and went back inside before she could talk herself out of it, aware of Mrs. Hab's worried eyes following her the whole way, and of the low murmur of the gathered neighbours already speculating on what business a common flower girl could possibly have with a house as grand as Ashbourne. She tucked the walking stick carefully into her basket once more before she left, wrapped in its cloth as it had been since that first grey morning, telling herself it would serve as proof enough of her honesty, whatever awaited her at the end of that long, unfamiliar road. The journey took the better part of the morning, the carriage rattling first through the crowded streets of London and then out along quieter country roads, hedgerows and fields replacing the tenement rows Aurelia knew so well. She'd never travelled so far from the city in her life, and despite her nerves, she found herself watching the passing countryside with a kind of cautious wonder. The green sweep of pasture, the distant shapes of grazing sheep, the world opening up wider than she'd ever quite imagined it could. Ashbourne Manor, when it finally came into view, stopped her breath entirely. The house rose from a gentle rise of land, pale stone catching the morning light, its windows tall and many, flanked by rows of clipped hedges and a long gravel drive that curved up toward columned steps, grander than anything she'd seen even outside the finest theatres of London. She'd known, from Mrs. Culpepper's words the evening before, that she was travelling to a duke's estate. But knowing it and seeing it were two entirely different things. The footman helped her down from the carriage, and for a moment she simply stood there, clutching her basket to her chest, feeling every inch the flower girl she was among such surroundings. Her boots were scuffed, her cloak patched at one shoulder, and she was suddenly, acutely aware of how out of place she must look against the grandeur of the house before her. A butler met her at the door and led her through a wide entrance hall lined with portraits she didn't dare look at too closely, and then into a long room fitted floor to ceiling with books, their leather spines catching the light from tall windows overlooking the grounds. A man stood near the far window, his back to her at first, dressed in a dark, well-cut coat that spoke plainly of wealth, without needing any ornament to prove it. He turned as she entered,
and Aurelia found herself facing a man perhaps in his early 30s, tall and composed, with the same grey eyes she remembered from the old man in the archway, though sharper here, more guarded, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Miss Penn," he said, inclining his head slightly. "Thank you for coming. I am Julian Kingswood." "Your Grace," Aurelia said, dropping into the curtsy she'd only ever practiced in her own head, unsure whether she managed it properly at all. "I confess I don't fully understand why I've been asked here." "Please, sit." He gestured toward a chair near the window and waited until she'd settled into it, her basket held carefully in her lap, before taking a seat across from her, close enough that she could feel the weight of his attention even as he chose his next words with evident care. "My father returned home some days ago," he said, in rather better spirits than I'd expected, given that he'd gone missing during a storm and given us all a considerable fright in the process. He spoke, at some length, of a young flower vendor who'd shown him a kindness he seemed to find quite remarkable. Aurelia's heart gave an unsteady lurch. "The old man? From the storm?" "My father, yes." Something flickered across Julian's face at that. Not quite a smile, though not entirely without warmth either. "Lord Thaddeus Kingswood. He has a habit, I'm afraid, of wandering the city in plain dress, observing how ordinary people conduct themselves when they believe no one of consequence is watching. It has caused this household no small amount of worry over the years, though I've never yet managed to talk him out of it." "He never told me who he was," Aurelia said. "I only knew him as an old man in need of shelter." "So he said." Julian's gaze sharpened slightly, and Aurelia felt, for the first time since entering the room, the full weight of his caution settle over her. "You'll forgive me, Miss Penn, if I confess to a degree of skepticism. My father is an elderly man of considerable means, however plainly he chooses to dress. Stories of his generosity towards strangers on the street tend, in my experience, to attract a particular kind of attention from those hoping to profit by it." "I want nothing from your family," Aurelia said, her spine straightening despite the grandeur pressing in around her. "I gave him my stool and my wrap because he was cold, and no one else troubled themselves to help him. I shared my supper because he was hungry. I never asked his name, and I certainly never asked what he was worth." "And yet you kept his walking stick," Julian said, his eyes flicking briefly to the basket in her lap. "Because I meant to return it," she said, unable to keep a note of frustration from her voice now. "He was gone before I woke, and I've carried it with me every day since, hoping I might cross his path again to give it back properly. If that makes me suspect in your eyes, then I don't know what more I could have done differently, short of leaving it lying in the mud." For a long moment, Julian said nothing, simply watching her with that same careful, measuring look, and Aurelia forced herself to meet it steadily, refusing to look away or apologize for something she'd done with an entirely clear conscience. Whatever test this was, whatever judgment he was weighing behind those grey eyes so like his father's, she would not shrink from it simply because the room around her was grander than any she'd ever stood in. "Perhaps," Julian said finally, his voice quieter now, though no less guarded. "You'd be willing to prove that further, Miss Penn. If you've truly nothing to gain from any of this, I imagine you won't object to showing me so." Julian led her from the library down a short corridor to a smaller room fitted out as a study, shelves of ledgers lining one wall, a broad oak desk positioned near the window. He gestured for her to sit across from it, and Aurelia did, still holding her basket close, though she'd begun to notice how her arms ached from clutching it so tightly through the long carriage ride and the stranger, longer walk through the Manor's grand halls. "A moment, if you would," Julian said, and crossed to a low cabinet set against the far wall. He returned, carrying a wooden tray, which he set down on the desk between them with a care that told Aurelia this was no idle gesture, whatever it was meant to prove. Upon the tray lay a scattering of small items: a woman's lace handkerchief, a pair of silver spectacles, and, gleaming plainly among them, a small stack of gold coins. "These were recovered from various parts of the city over the past several months," Julian said, watching her closely as he spoke. "Items left behind, lost, or otherwise misplaced by members of this household or their acquaintances during my father's wanderings, and others besides. I've made something of a habit, given his tendency to leave things scattered wherever he goes, of testing the honesty of those who claim to have found them. Aurelia looked at the tray, and then at him, understanding settling over her slowly, cold and unwelcome. You think I mean to claim something that isn't mine? I think, Julian said carefully, that many people, faced with such an opportunity, would find it difficult to resist at least trying. She felt the sting of it keenly, though she supposed she couldn't entirely blame him for his suspicion. He didn't know her. He knew only that a stranger had appeared at his door, claiming an association with his father, carrying an item of value she might easily have kept for herself and sold for a sum that would have fed her for a month or more. Of course, a man in his position would be cautious. Of course, he would want proof before extending any trust to someone so far beneath his own standing. Still, it stung. I don't need your tray to prove what's mine and what isn't, she said, and reached into her basket instead, pulling free the cloth-wrapped bundle she'd carried so carefully these past days. She unwound it slowly and set the walking stick across the desk between them, the polished wood catching the light from the window. This belongs to your father. I've no interest in the rest of what's sitting on that tray, gold or otherwise. I came to return what was left behind, not to see what else I might carry away with me. Julian's gaze moved from the stick to the coins still sitting untouched beside it, and something in his expression shifted, some measure of the guardedness easing, though not entirely. You could have sold it, he said. A stick of that quality would have fetched a fair price from the right buyer. No one would have known any different. I would have known, Aurelia said simply. That's reason enough. And the coins, you've barely glanced at them. Because they're not mine, and I've no use pretending otherwise. I held onto the stick because I meant to see it back in his hands, not because I thought it might be worth something to someone willing to pay for it. She met his eyes steadily. I've been poor most of my life, Your Grace. Poor enough to know exactly what a handful of gold coins could do for someone in my position. But being poor has never once made me think it right to take what isn't mine, no matter how easily I might have gotten away with it. Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something caught between reluctant respect and lingering disbelief, as though he wanted very much to trust her and hadn't yet convinced himself it was safe to do so. My father spoke of you with a great deal of warmth, he said finally. He is not, as a rule, an easy man to impress. He has met a great many people over the years who wanted something from him, and he has grown rather skilled at recognizing the type long before they've finished introducing themselves. Then perhaps he saw something in me worth trusting, Aurelia said, though I confess I don't know what, beyond a stranger sharing her supper with an old man in the rain. Perhaps that was enough. Julian rose from behind the desk and crossed to the window, his back to her for a moment as he looked out over the grounds beyond. It is a rare thing, Miss Penn, to find someone who expects nothing in return for their kindness, rarer still among those with the least to spare. I don't think kindness ought to depend on how much a person has to give, Aurelia said. Seems to me the ones with the least understand best what it means to go without. That's reason enough to share what little there is. Julian turned back to face her then, and for the first time since she'd entered the manor, something like genuine warmth touched the careful composure of his expression. I begin to understand, he said quietly, why my father hasn't stopped speaking of you since he returned home. The drawing room Julian led her to next was smaller than the library, though no less grand, its walls hung with paintings of landscapes Aurelia didn't recognize, and a fire burning low in a marble hearth despite the mildness of the afternoon. He'd asked her to wait there while he sent word ahead, and she'd barely had time to smooth her skirts and settle herself into one of the tall chairs before the door opened again. Lord Thaddeus Kingswood stepped into the room, and for a long moment Aurelia simply stared, certain her eyes were playing some trick on her. Gone was the plain wool coat, the battered felt hat, the walking stick worn smooth from years of use. In their place stood a man dressed in fine, dark broadcloth, his cravat tied with careful precision, his silver hair combed back neatly from a face she recognized at once despite the transformation. those same sharp grey eyes finding hers across the room with unmistakable warmth. "Miss Penn," he said, and there was genuine pleasure in his voice, the kind that pulled her at once to her feet, unsure whether to curtsy or simply stand there gaping at him as she was doing now. "I confess I've been rather looking forward to seeing your face when you realized who I was." "You're the old man," she said, and then flushed at how foolish it sounded, though he only laughed, a warm, unhurried sound that filled the room easily. "I am indeed, though I suspect old man hardly does justice to a duke's father, however accurately it described me that evening beneath the theatre portico." He crossed the room toward her, moving with far steadier ease than he had that night in the rain, and took both her hands in his own before she could think to stop him. "I owe you my thanks, properly given this time, and a great many apologies besides for leaving so abruptly the following morning." "I woke and you were simply gone," Aurelia said. "I worried I'd done something wrong, or that you'd taken ill somewhere along the road." "Neither, I assure you. My carriage came for me before first light, as it always does when I've wandered further than I ought, and I confess I left in something of a hurry, eager to avoid the fuss my absence would have caused had I stayed to explain myself properly." He glanced toward Julian, who stood near the door, watching the exchange with an expression Aurelia couldn't quite read. "I take it my son has already subjected you to one of his little tests." "He wished to be certain of my intentions," Aurelia said carefully. "I don't fault him for it." "No," Thaddeus said, "though I imagine it stung all the same. Julian has grown rather cautious over the years, and not without reason. There are a great many people in this world eager to make use of an old man's fondness for wandering where he oughtn't." He released her hands and gestured for her to sit again, taking the chair beside her own. "But I've told him already, and I'll tell you now plainly, Miss Penn. You showed me a kindness that evening you had no reason to show a stranger. You didn't know my name, you didn't know my title or my fortune or anything at all beyond the fact that I was cold and hungry and in need of help. You gave me your stool, your wrap, and half of what little food you carried, and you asked for nothing in return." "Anyone would have done the same," Aurelia said quietly. "No," Thaddeus said, and something in his tone grew more serious. "That is precisely what I have spent 30 years discovering to be untrue. I have walked those same streets in that same plain coat more times than I could count, Miss Penn, testing exactly that question. And I have watched a great many well-dressed, well-fed people walk past an old man in need without so much as a second glance. You are the first in a very long while who stopped." Aurelia didn't quite know what to say to that. She'd never thought of her actions that night as anything remarkable, only as the plain, obvious thing any decent person ought to do when they saw another struggling. To hear it spoken of now as though it were rare, as though it had genuinely surprised a man who'd apparently made a habit of testing the world's kindness and finding it wanting, left her feeling strangely unsteady. "I only did what seemed right," she said finally. "I never expected anything to come of it beyond that." "I know," Thaddeus said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it. "That, more than anything else, is precisely why I mean to see something come of it regardless." Julian, still standing near the door, cleared his throat softly. "Father, I don't believe we've yet discussed with Miss Penn what exactly you have in mind." "No," Thaddeus agreed, a faint, knowing smile touching the corner of his mouth as he looked between his son and Aurelia. "I suppose we haven't. But I think it's high time we did." The estate's administrative office sat in a separate wing of the manor, reached through a long corridor lined with tall windows overlooking the gardens, and it was there that Aurelia found herself the following morning, seated once more in an unfamiliar chair, while men in fine coats discussed her future as though she weren't quite in the room at all. "With respect, Your Grace," said the man behind the desk, a thin, precise fellow, introduced to her as Mr. Wexley, the estate's chief steward. "I understand your father's sentiment in the matter, but surely a cash reward would settle the debt far more sensibly. A generous sum, properly given, would see the girl comfortably provided for without the need to involve her further in the household's affairs." "The girl has a name," Thaddeus said mildly from his seat near the window, though there was an edge beneath the mildness that made Wexley's shoulders stiffen slightly. My apologies. Miss Penn, then. Wexley inclined his head toward her, though his tone remained carefully measured. The tone of a man accustomed to managing difficult conversations without ever quite raising his voice. I mean no disrespect. Only that a permanent position within the estate's operations is not a matter to be decided lightly, whatever the circumstances of how it came to be considered. There are questions of experience, of training, of how such an appointment might be received by the rest of the household staff, many of whom have served this family for years, and would rightly wonder why a stranger from the city should be given such trust so suddenly. She returned my father's property without hesitation, Julian said, when she might easily have kept it, or sold it, or simply said nothing at all and let the matter disappear entirely. I watched her refuse gold coins she could have claimed without any fear of consequence. That is not nothing, Wexley. Honesty is a fine quality, Your Grace, and I don't dispute it. But honesty alone does not qualify a person to oversee the conservatories and botanical supply for an estate of this size. That work requires knowledge, and knowledge takes years to build properly. I sell flowers for my living, Aurelia said, before she could quite stop herself, and both men turned toward her as though surprised to hear her speak at all. I've traded at Blackfriars Market for 5 years. I know which blooms hold through a hard frost and which wither the moment the weather turns. I know how to bargain a fair price from a supplier without being cheated, and how to keep stock fresh enough to sell through a full week's trade without losing half of it to spoilage. I don't know your household's ways, Mr. Wexley, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I know flowers, and I know honest work, better perhaps than anyone else you'll find willing to take the position. Wexley studied her for a long moment, something in his carefully composed expression shifting slightly, though whether toward grudging respect or simple surprise, Aurelia couldn't quite tell. You speak plainly, he said finally. I've never had much use for anything else. A useful quality, in its own way, Thaddeus said, a faint smile touching his mouth as he watched the exchange, though not always a comfortable one for those unused to hearing it. Julian rose from where he'd been standing near the desk, and something in his bearing had settled since the day before, a decision plainly made and no longer requiring further discussion, whatever objections his steward might still wish to raise. I've made my decision, Wexley. Miss Penn will be given charge of the estate's conservatories and botanical supply operations, on a trial basis if it eases your concerns, though I don't expect the trial to reveal anything beyond what I already witnessed for myself yesterday in this very office. Your Grace, if I may— You may object as thoroughly as you wish, Julian said, though not unkindly, but the matter is settled. I would rather trust this estate's greenhouses to a woman who refused a tray of gold coins on principle than to anyone recommended to me on the strength of connections alone. Miss Penn has already proven, in the space of 2 days, more integrity than I've seen from a great many men who've served this household for years. Wexley's mouth tightened briefly, though he said nothing further, only inclining his head in the stiff, formal manner of a man accustomed to accepting decisions he privately disagreed with. Aurelia felt the weight of his disapproval settle over the room, even as Julian's words settled something else entirely in her own chest. A small, cautious warmth she hadn't expected to feel amid all the grandeur and suspicion of the past 2 days. I don't know how to properly thank you both, she said, looking between Julian and his father. I came here only meaning to return a walking stick. And instead, Thaddeus said, rising slowly from his chair with the aid of the very stick in question, now returned to its rightful place beside him. You've reminded an old man, and perhaps his son besides, that there remains a good deal of honest kindness left in this world, however rarely we manage to find it. That is no small thing, Miss Penn, whatever your intentions in coming here. Julian caught her eye then, something steady and sincere passing between them that hadn't been there the day before, when his gaze had held only careful suspicion. Welcome to Ashbourne, Miss Penn, he said. I believe you'll find the conservatories in rather desperate need of someone who actually understands flowers. The Manor's conservatory stretched out beneath a vaulted glass roof, sunlight pouring through panes still speckled here and there with the dust of neglect, and Aurelia stood at its center the following afternoon, turning slowly to take in the full scope of what she'd been given charge of. Rows of raised beds ran the length of the space, many overgrown or half-abandoned, tangled vines climbing wild where careful hands hadn't tended them in far too long. A few hardy blooms still struggled on regardless, stubborn patches of color amid the neglect, and Aurelia felt something settle in her chest at the sight of them, some quiet certainty that this, at least, was work she knew how to do properly.
It hasn't been managed with any real purpose since our last conservatory keeper left some years back, Julian said, coming to stand beside her, a rolled parchment tucked beneath one arm. My father grew too occupied with his wandering to concern himself with it, and I confess, horticulture has never been among my own particular talents. It shows, Aurelia said, and then flushed slightly at her own bluntness, though Julian only laughed. I did warn you it needed someone who understood flowers. He led her to a small writing table set near the conservatory's entrance, where he unrolled the parchment he'd carried and smoothed it flat between them. It was a contract, written in careful legal hand, granting her full management of the estate's conservatories and botanical supply operations, along with use of a small cottage on the grounds near the Eastern Gardens, and a wage more generous than anything Aurelia had earned in her life, selling flowers on a London street corner. You needn't decide this instant, Julian said, watching her study the document. I know it's a great deal to consider, coming as quickly as it has. I've spent 5 years scraping together a living one bunch of lavender at a time, Aurelia said, still reading, her finger tracing carefully over each line, as though half expecting the words to change if she looked away. I never once imagined anything like this. You earned it, Julian said simply, not through any misfortune of ours, nor through any pity on my father's part. You earned it through your own honesty, proven twice over now, first in a storm neither of us witnessed, and again in a study where I gave you every reason to take what wasn't yours, and you refused regardless. Aurelia looked up from the contract then, meeting his eyes properly for what felt like the first time since she'd arrived at Ashbourne, and found none of the careful suspicion that had marked their first meeting, only something steadier, something that looked, unmistakably, like respect. There is one condition I ought to mention, Julian said, though I hope you won't find it unreasonable. Which is? The flowers grown here, once the conservatories are properly restored, needn't remain solely for the estate's own use. I should like to see some portion of what's grown distributed back to the city vendors, particularly those struggling to keep proper stock through the harder seasons. You understand that trade far better than anyone in this household, Miss Penn. I trust your judgment in how best to manage it. Aurelia felt something tighten pleasantly in her throat at that, an idea already forming, half-formed thoughts of the vendors she knew from Blackfriars, women like herself who fought every week simply to keep their stalls stocked through lean months. I'd like that very much, she said, more than I can properly say. She signed the contract there, at the small writing table, her hand steadier than she expected, given how quickly her heart was beating. And when she set down the pen, Julian extended his hand to shake hers properly, in the manner of two people concluding honest business, rather than any grand favour bestowed from one so far above her. Welcome properly to Ashbourne, then, he said. Not as a guest this time, but as someone with real purpose here. Thank you, Aurelia said, though I think it's you and your father who deserve the greater thanks for trusting a stranger with something this precious to your family. You were never entirely a stranger, Thaddeus said, appearing in the conservatory doorway with his walking stick tapping softly against the stone floor, having evidently been listening to at least the last part of their conversation. Not since the night you gave a cold, tired old man your only dry cloth without asking his name first. I knew before I'd finished my share of that bread who I was dealing with, Miss Penn. It only took my son a little longer to catch up. Julian shot his father a look that carried more affection than irritation, and Aurelia found herself smiling properly for the first time since she'd first climbed into that unmarked carriage outside Willow Lane, uncertain and afraid of what awaited her at the journey's end. She thought, standing there amid the tangled, neglected beds of Ashbourne's conservatory, with the contract still fresh beneath her signature, of how strange it was that a single evening's kindness, offered without any thought of reward, had led her here,
not through charity, not through pity, but through her own honest character, recognized and repaid in full by two men who might so easily have dismissed her as nothing more than a poor flower girl, unworthy of their notice. She meant to prove in the months ahead that their trust hadn't been misplaced. 3 months had passed since Aurelia first signed her name to that contract, and the conservatory bore little resemblance now to the tangled, neglected space she'd first stood in beneath its dusty glass roof. Rows of beds ran neat and orderly along its length, filled with lavender and roses and the hardy autumn blooms she'd carefully chosen to see the estate through the coming season, and the whole space smelled faintly, always, of growing things properly tended. She stood near the entrance that morning, checking over a ledger of the week's deliveries, when Julian found her, as he often did now, making his way through the rows with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, and an ease about him she hadn't seen in their first careful, guarded meeting. "The Blackfriars order is ready?" he asked. "Loaded onto the cart an hour ago." Aurelia closed the ledger and set it aside. "Mrs. Culpepper's stall alone will have fresh violets through the whole of next week, and I've sent word to 3 other vendors besides, offering the same terms. Fair prices, steady supply, no more scraping to fill a stall from whatever scraps the wholesalers leave behind." It had become, over these past months, something of a quiet passion of hers, this careful arrangement between the grand conservatories of Ashbourne and the struggling flower sellers of the city she'd once counted herself among. She'd hired 2 former street vendors already, women who'd known hard seasons same as she had, and paid them a wage fair enough that neither needed to choose between rent and supper the way she'd so often had to in her own years at Blackfriars. "You've done more with this place in 3 months, Julian said, than my father managed in the whole decade before you arrived. Your father was rather too occupied wandering the theatre district in disguise to worry much over conservatories," Aurelia said, and Julian laughed, the sound easy and unguarded now in a way it rarely had been that first difficult day in his study. As if summoned by the mention of him, Lord Thaddeus appeared at the far end of the row, his walking stick tapping its familiar rhythm against the stone path, though he moved with rather more steadiness now than he had that stormy night beneath the theatre portico. He'd taken, since Aurelia's arrival, to spending a good deal of his mornings in the conservatory himself, claiming an interest in the flowers that Aurelia privately suspected had rather more to do with simple company than any real fondness for gardening. "I hear the Blackfriars order is away," he said, joining them among the roses. "Mrs. Culpepper sent word through one of the delivery person, thanking you most warmly. Said something about how it was strange seeing an old friend's granddaughter's stall thriving again after such a hard year of it." "She was kind to me, back when I had little enough to offer in return," Aurelia said. "It seemed right to see that kindness repaid, now that I've the means to do it properly." "That seems to be rather a habit of yours," Thaddeus said, settling himself onto the low stone bench near the fountain, where he liked to sit and watch the morning light fall through the glass overhead. "Kindness offered without expectation, and repaid tenfold by whatever strange turn fortune takes afterward. I confess I've grown rather fond of watching it play out." Aurelia smiled, though she found herself, as she often did these days, thinking back to that first grey morning after the storm, when she'd woken alone beneath a stone archway, with nothing but an old man's forgotten walking stick to show for a night's kindness. She hadn't expected anything to come of it then. She hadn't wanted anything to come of it, beyond the simple, plain satisfaction of having done right by someone in need. And yet here she stood, 3 months later, mistress of Ashbourne's conservatories, her own small cottage waiting for her at the edge of the eastern gardens, her name spoken now with genuine warmth by 2 men who'd once had every reason to view her with suspicion instead. "I've been thinking," Julian said, drawing her attention back from her thoughts, "of expanding the arrangement further. There are other estates near here, other families who might be persuaded to see the value in what you've built, if given a proper demonstration of it. I wondered whether you'd be willing to advise on such a project, beyond the borders of Ashbourne itself. You'd trust me with more than just your own conservatories?" "I'd trust you with a great deal more than that," Julian said, and something in the quiet certainty of his tone made Aurelia's chest tighten pleasantly, though neither of them said anything further on the matter just then, content instead to let the moments settle quietly between them among the roses. Thaddeus, watching the exchange from his seat by the fountain, said nothing at all, though the faint, knowing smile that touched his mouth suggested he understood a good deal more than either of them had spoken aloud. Later that afternoon, as Aurelia walked the length of the conservatory alone, checking over the season's final plantings before the light faded, she thought of how strange and unlikely the whole of it seemed, looking back. A single evening's shelter offered to a stranger in the rain, a walking stick carried carefully through a week of uncertainty, a test of honesty she'd passed without ever meaning to prove anything at all, beyond the simple truth of her own character. It had reshaped the whole of her life in ways she could never have predicted that stormy night beneath St. Jude's portico, and it had asked nothing of her in return, beyond the plain, ordinary decency she'd always believed anyone ought to show a stranger in need. She supposed that was the whole of the lesson in it, if there was one to be found. Kindness, given freely, without calculation or hope of reward, had a way of finding its way back tenfold, though never in the manner one might have expected, and never for the reasons one might have hoped.